Before we begin, I have a few things to go over that I should have included in the background and lore portion of the last episode. Ringo Starr was a fantastic choice as a narrator, as his soft tones and accent really makes the stories comfy to listen to, with a range of emotions that can change to suit the scene. However, I do think he can sound a little bit flat in his delivery sometimes though, which is something I think Michael Angelis did a better job with later on. Just going by the sound of voice though, I still prefer Ringo. Ringo also provided the narration for the first two series in the US dub of the show too, but later on, when the legendary George Carlin took over, he went back and redubbed Ringo's episodes too. It's completely up to the viewer to decide if they prefer Ringo or George, but just for the purposes of these reviews, I'm going to be using Ringo's original UK narration. In the last episode, I think I could have formatted it a bit better since it was a pretty brief summary of the story, with just a little bit and a conclusion afterwards, which didn't flow very well I think. So, going forwards, I'm just going to be going through the episode as it happens in sequence, giving my thoughts on things and little tidbits as they happen, with a wrap-up at the end. That'll just flow better, I think. Well then, that's the preamble out the way. Time for the episode. Edward and Gordon is the second episode of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, but it's actually based on the story, which was the first entry in the Railway series. As far as I can remember, Thomas didn't even appear in the very first story. I suppose it would be a bit strange starting the show with an episode not about the titular character, so I see why they did it. From the very beginning, I already have something amusing to point out about this episode.
One day, Edward was in the shed where he lived with the other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it.
They were all bigger than Edward.
Moving on. Edward is a wise, old, hard-working engine. At the start of the episode, everyone's teasing him about being weaker and smaller than them, and he's a bit upset with it. We see a close-up of his drivers here, and one thing I never actually realised as a child was that the models in the close-ups are not actually the same ones that we see in shots accompanying the engines. The ones we see there are smaller and have considerably less detail, while the close-up ones are bigger, usually with a large-scale model of the engine around them. It's here we get to listen to Edward's theme for the first time, which is a cheerful, warm tune that reflects his character. He's a hard-working, pleasant engine, who is more than happy to just get on with his job without fuss, and treats the rolling stock well. This is of course backed up by the narration telling us exactly this. As with the previous episode before, we get a lovely shot of Edward travelling at sunset, and after that is the first nighttime scene, which is something this show would go on to do wonderfully. This one doesn't last very long, and I'm not going to sit here and point out every single time we see a night sky in the episode, or any other episodes, unless it's worth mentioning. But, since this is the first one, I thought it was worth bringing up. Edward does his work and returns home, thinking that the other engines might have learned something by example and backed off. But, come the morning, nothing has changed. It's just another day of them boasting to him, with Gordon especially taking to the podium to show off. And, is that dried blood on his first end? I don't think I want to know. Edward doesn't really care though, and he just goes about his business. Here we meet the troublesome trucks for the first time, who would be the consistent antagonists of the series, always up to no good and causing a great deal of grief for the engines. Their design here would be unique to Series 1, because after that, they'd get faces. Did anyone ever notice that they actually have mouths? I always thought that they just had eyes, but if you look closely, just right there, you can see the mouth. I always found Ringo's narration here amusing too.
To each other. What? They cried. Whatever is happening?
Gordon goes past looking very angry, being forced to pull a goods train which he believes is beneath him. This already sets up a noticeable difference between Edward and him, since the former is happy to just perform whatever task is asked for him with little fuss, while the latter is only happy when he's pulling nice shiny passenger coaches. Also, I found Gordon's angry face bloody terrifying as a child. The wide eyes coupled with that brow furrowed in fury with the wrinkles just seemed so nightmarish to me. Then it turns out that Gordon, the big splendid engine with immense strength, has gotten himself stuck on a hill pulling his goods train, and it's up to the supposedly small and weak Edward to help him. The drivers say that Gordon isn't trying, and Gordon blames the trucks, and I'm not entirely sure who I believe here. Does his distaste for the train he's pulling give him a sort of mental block that prevents him from giving his maximum effort, or is he just being lazy? Who knows? The theme that plays when Edward is helping Gordon uphill is the ever-tense breakdown train theme, which always adds a level of intensity to a scene. Gordon repeatedly complains that he can't do it, while Edward defiantly pushes back with reassurances that he can. I'm going to sound a bit controversial here. The early seasons have this storytelling quirk of repetition in dialogue, which is retained from the books, inspired by the Reverend Audrey, hearing the puffs of engines he could hear, and interpret. I may sound controversial, but I think that's something which honestly reads better as lines in a book than dialogue spoken on screen, as actually hearing it out loud spoken by Ringo in the context of an actual episode script, it sounds a bit odd, especially when he says it fast like that.
I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it, puffed Gordon. I will do it. I will do it. I will do it, puffed Edward.
I don't hate it, and, it's a kids' show and they need a nice narration to get them through it. But personally, I just think it sounds a bit odd. I don't hate it, and I don't want it removed. Yeah. Edward eventually succeeds in pushing Gordon over the hill, and Gordon speeds away, forgetting Edward in the process. Edward rolls down after him, feeling very tired. He's actually wearing James's sad face here, an example of the face swapping, which was actually a semi-frequent occurrence in the classic series, which wasn't always a huge issue, but sometimes it was kind of nightmarish. Despite Gordon having left without so much as a thank you, the episode ends with Edward still pleased with his effort, and the reward of a nice fresh coat of paint from his crew. Edward and Gordon is a great episode, which once again sets up a good example for the audience. Being humble and getting on with your work, even if it's perceived as dirty and beneath you, is much more rewarding than being boastful and uppity, even if it's sometimes a thankless job. But, given that these engines were written with the point of view of the engines being sentient tools who are expected to work under threat of being scrapped if they couldn't perform, it's up to decide if that moral holds as much weight when applied to human workers or not engines. Remember, sometimes you will be asked to do work that you don't like. That's just part of life. However, you shouldn't be taken for granted and used as a slave. I think. Something like that. Either way, it's a nice introduction to one of the main characters and a further look at Gordon. In the first episode we got to see him get his revenge on Thomas for pulling tricks on him, and in this one we see him in turn in the hot seat, at the mercy of another engine's assistance. That sounded a lot less dramatic in my head. The scenery here is more diverse, with some more interesting shots like this one from the bridge and the previously mentioned close-ups of the engines and models. The hill, which would later become dubbed Gordon's Hill due to the events of the episode, seems large and imposing, and there's another example of the production design, provoking the imagination with that sea in the background. It's not super detailed and it's a bit hard to make out, but the fact that you can see it in the background just adds a little bit extra to world building, doesn't it? So, that's 2 nice episodes to start the show with. Will episode 3 be just as good? Well, most people already know. It is. Come back next time for episode 3, The Sad Story of Henry. Thank you.